Greetings and welcome from the League of Women Voters of Portland. I'm Debbie Kay, League President. The League of Women Voters believes that making democracy work is our primary effort. One of our core beliefs is that democracy functions best when voters are informed about issues and engaged in their communities. For that reason, we present programs like this to give our Portland and Multnomah County neighbors an opportunity to think about the issues that affect our lives and well-being in our communities. We're pleased to have you join our program today, featuring League members from throughout the United States who attended the 2021 United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow, Scotland last fall. They will share information about specific topics covered at the climate conference, which was called COP26. The League is grateful for support from the Carol and Velma Sailing Foundation and from our media partner, Metro East Community Media. They record our civic education panels and voter education presentations and rebroadcast them on community access channels and social media. Please tell your friends and family to watch this program when it's posted on our website, lwvpdx.org, on or after Friday, March 11th. In addition, I am pleased to report that the Portland League is creating podcasts from our civic education and voter education programs. We hope you and your friends will find it convenient to listen to our podcasts on your favorite platforms. You may also listen from a link on our website. We sincerely thank our speakers, the moderator, and the League volunteers who donate their time and expertise to bring these programs to you. The moderator for tonight's program is Robin Tokmakian, the League of Women Voters of the United States United Nations Observer for Climate Change. Robin attended COP26 and is a member of the Portland League and also serves on the board of the League of Women Voters of Oregon. I'm happy to turn the program over to my esteemed colleague, Robin Tokmakian.
Thank you, Debbie. Good afternoon or evening, wherever you might be. We've gathered a group of League members from around the country who attended the UN's climate conference in November to share their experience and what they learned. But before we continue with the discussion, let me briefly describe the conference and its purpose. So the UN's climate conference, or the Conference of the Parties, COP, or COP as we refer to it, is the official meeting of member states who signed the UN's treaty, the Framework Convention for Climate Change, in the 1990s. Under this treaty fall both the Kyoto Protocol Agreement and the Paris Agreement. The US is a signatory to the overall agreement, the Framework Protocol, and the Paris Agreement, but it is not a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. So every year, the parties to the treaty meet and negotiate various aspects of the treaty. For example, its implementation rules, its financing rules, and the transparency rules. But on the sidelines of the official business of the treaty are educational, advocacy, promotional events that are held by governments, businesses, and non-governmental organizations or groups of organizations. There is also a considerable amount of lobbying done by each of these entities. Without going into too much detail at this point, the outcomes of the official UN portion included finalizing the Paris Agreement rulebook so that it could be implemented. And some member states also agreed to stronger action in the climate area, including reduction to the use of coal and in methane emissions. So let's begin with our discussion. And the people joining us today are Carol Parker of the North San Diego League, Tony Monette, who's co-president of the Nebraska League, Ashley Ravichet, who's a member of the California League and is the former league president of San Francisco. And last, Cynthia Bell, who is president of the Hudson Valley New York League. So we're going to start by covering several different topics, and each person is going to address initially the topic that we've assigned them. And then we'll have a question and answer period at the end. So first, let's go to Ashley and about transparency. And we know that transparency is a fundamental position of the League. Can you give us an overall view of how transparent the UN process is during the COP?
Thank you, Robin. Making sure that I am, not on mute. So thank you and good evening, everyone, for joining us here at this climate debrief. My name is Ashley Ravichet. I am the Volunteer Deputy Area Director of Social Policy for the League of Women Voters of California. And I'm here to address transparency and what I observed at COP26. As League members, just as you mentioned, Robin, we understand the concept of transparency as it relates to open government, accountability, preservation of common good. From this perspective, we can see that COP26 presented many obstacles for transparency, including having closed-door meetings that excluded state actors who were most impacted by the climate crisis, as well as lack of access to the negotiations for observers. We also saw that there were limits to youth, women, Indigenous voices at the global stocktake. And there were a lot of false solutions and greenwashing as part of the overall narrative at the event. Many of these obstacles to transparency were compounded as a result of the pandemic, which limited the capacity of individuals to participate as well as movement within the conference. However, the pandemic served to increase transparency in some regards within the framework of establishing virtual participation, providing access to draft documents and streamed events for virtual participants. We saw that it was often more accessible to participate outside of the conference than it was for the observers that were there on the ground. When I speak of transparency, I'm going to be doing it in terms of the technical modalities of the UN negotiations. So under this lens, transparency involves procedures for nationally determined contribution reports, NDCs, which serve the purpose of increasing credibility within the climate action plans, and also is really important for the trust building that's required for all of the negotiations. So let me take a step back and first define what nationally determined contributions are, or NDCs. They're voluntary reports that countries submit to the UN, and they highlight the objectives that a member state is taking to transition to that low carbon and climate resilient economy. So under the Paris Agreement, member states were asked to submit these reports, NDCs, every 5 years as a way of tracking the global progress. We've just, under COP26, seen those first release of the NDC reports, and the UN has scheduled a global stocktake beginning in 2023. So that's coming up. So here's where the question of transparency comes in. NDCs are nationally determined. Therefore, there's a variety of approaches on measuring, collecting, and even formatting that report. During COP26, because we got to see some of the first round of the NDCs being disseminated, they were trickling in, and those discussions unveiled a lot of controversy, raising transparency concerns. It reinvigorated conversations over data on emissions, how emissions are being measured, and specific timeframes for adaptive solutions. So before I go too deep, let me review some of the positive achievements that we were able to observe at COP26 in regards to transparency. First, global consensus was reached on the 2006 IPCC report. So what the IPCC report does is it establishes the scientific community's measurements, including modeling of the climate crisis. So this consensus on that report was paramount to moving forward for any climate discussions. This consensus put to bed any of the baseless discussions that we had still occurring even at COP26, that were some actors in some states were still discrediting that we are even in the middle of a climate crisis. And it shifted the discussion to the data that the scientists were discovering. And it allows member states who are contributing to these NDC reports to really have a higher level of confidence. Moreover, the consensus on the IPCC standards identified who of those member states are the highest contributors to global emissions and where those countries are feeling the greatest impacts. So the adoption of this report helped achieve our transparency goals on this roadmap towards transparency. It established these standards on measurements and modeling, and it furthermore reinvigorated the conversation that the target climate of 2.5 degrees Celsius is just not sufficient to keeping our planet alive and thriving. So at COP26, we saw that consensus move to a global warming target of 1.5 degrees Celsius as the only goal to keep our planet alive. So the last improvement that we saw at COP26 was the achievement of increasing the narrative for a more ambitious plan for both finance and a just transition, which includes perspectives of women, gender, youth, and Indigenous voices in the adaptation plans. So for many individuals, including the observers, including myself, activists, state actors, these were very incremental changes and they were insufficient. But in terms of transparency, I want to just highlight that for developing nations, the consensus on the scientific measurements and tools helps them start to collect the information they need to even publish a report on NDCs. For developing countries, creating that NDC report is the highest achievement they've been able to make as they move towards a climate action plan. So it also puts people who are part of that highest emitting country on notice. The data and the efforts for the self-reporting of the reports often contradict what we have as the public opinion on levels of perceived effort for changes in adapting to the climate crisis. Overall, every one of us received that call to action for a more ambitious response to the climate emergency. So let me return to transparency because that's really the technical aspect of what I'm trying to identify here. It is the most technical agenda item of COP26. Reaching consensus on how to measure carbon emissions and reporting who the greatest contributors are was no small feat. It also came just in time for the next phase of the negotiations at the Conference of the Parties, which is the negotiations for the Enhanced Transparency Network, which are scheduled in 2024. So the Enhanced Transparency Network will include agreements on these common modalities, procedures, as well as the guidelines for member states to report their nationally determined contributions. So now let me share what I observed as well at COP26, and that is specifically what our country is doing to improve transparency. The United States delegation has taken a very strong position and a leadership role in all of the transparency negotiations. Its position is to confront and to manage those parties who raise credibility concerns in their response and in their reports. To achieve this, the United States and NASA have developed the EOS satellite program. And the EOS satellite program will measure aerosol greenhouse gases that could be emitted in many different variety of ways, including industrial operations, catastrophic fire events, sandstorms, and even measure sea level evaporation. So basically, all of the terrible effects of the climate crisis, the EOS satellite technology will be able to measure in real time. Moreover, that data that is collected will be open source, and it will become a tool to assist developing nations who cannot afford to do their own data measurements to track their progress for their NDCs, or their nationally determined contributions. So with this new technology, member states reporting the NDCs will be able to rely on that high level of trust, the reduced uncertainty, and succeed on that roadmap for transparency. So before I close and provide ample opportunity for the rest of our panelists to do their deep dive on their own observations, I just want to highlight what's to come for transparency. The next round of transparency negotiations will be finalized at COP27, as well as some of the enhanced transparency framework reports will be due in 2024, which should be around COP28. So under this enhanced transparency framework, which was part of the Paris Agreement, Article 13, there are 3 key takeaways. First is to build mutual trust and confidence, as well as to promote effective implementation. Second is to create capacity building and a capacity building initiative for transparency to assist those developing countries so that they can build the necessary institutions, develop processes, and comply with this transparency framework. The last item for the take home is to adopt common reporting tables and formats for this agreement. So in essence, under this last COP conference, COP26, the global consensus in adopting the IPCC reports and the scientific standards and metrics, that is achieving that last tier, which is super important. So before I go, I just want to thank you for your time. And I'd also like in the chat to be able to plug what the League of Women Voters is doing for its own ambition and increased ambition to respond and amplify what we can do at a local level to help impact climate. And I will go ahead and put that into the chat. And thank you very much. I will stick around for questions. Back to you, Robin.
Thank you, Ashley. We're going to continue rather than go into asking Ashley some more questions because of time constraint. We'll have a discussion about Indigenous people. And so one of the issues that needs to be still resolved at COP is referred to as loss and damage, and how this is addressed. And it is a topic that affects the Indigenous peoples of the world the most. So Tony, can you give us a brief overview of the loss and damage issue and why it is such an important issue globally?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everyone. Good evening, and good to see you all. So the concept of loss and damage as it relates to climate change refers to the loss of both tangible and intangible resources, land, infrastructure, etc., at the hands of climate change and climate-related weather events. Loss and damage is most commonly referred to by countries in the global south, aka the countries that experience and bear the brunt of climate change the most for the longest extended periods of time. So the ask in terms of loss and damage is for reparations already caused by the climate change crisis in these geographic areas, primarily in the form of reallocation of land, monies for loss and damage that have already been experienced by climate change and its effects. To dive a little bit deeper into the specific relation of loss and damage to COP26, or the Conference of the Parties conference that we attended, the COP26, there was a discussion in regards to a loss and damage treaty. It included the US if adopted, committing $3 million to such an effort to recuperate land and other resources, and also included other countries as well. Though this discussion did not make it clearly into the finalized decisions from COP26, those that experience the most loss and damage, as Robin mentioned, are those who have some of the lowest greenhouse emissions and carbon emissions. Those affected by climate change, of course, need to be included in the narrative, particularly in the delivery of the message about loss and damage and how climate change and its effects understand and help us to understand the local context in which we are dealing with, and to make sure that the solutions to address the climate crisis are included. Additionally, the developed world is responsible for 80% or more of climate change carbon emissions in the areas of energy, transportation, and buildings. Furthermore, 80% of displaced women globally are due to climate change. These two figures give us a stark example of how loss and damage globally is a huge problem, and it's something that needs to be included in the negotiations and further the finalized decisions from the UN Climate Convention and from COP. So globally, it's a matter of recognizing our global privilege and addressing the colonialism that we've experienced across our history that has gotten us here in the first place. Something to note globally, because of the effects on Indigenous people as it relates to loss and damage, Indigenous people bear the names, of course, in the United States of Native Americans and other original inhabitants of our globe. And since we live in a global world, there are several considerations as it relates to loss and damage that we might want to consider. The first being Indigenous rights that have been violated due to the restriction of access to land and the displacement of territories. And this is a non-economic impact, but it is included in the loss and damage conversation. Additionally, the quantitative aspects that I mentioned earlier of land, of resources, of infrastructure that can be quantified are one aspect of loss and damage. Another consideration, though, are the aspects that cannot, that a number cannot be placed on, such as the cultural and spiritual loss, for example, burial grounds, relocalization of people, and no longer being able to harvest in areas amongst other aspects that are important to Indigenous people. So with that being said, it's abundantly clear that the global perspective on climate change is unavoidable, and that loss and damage, particularly as it relates to the global North and the global South, are viewed differently. However, they are both necessary in many ways. So a key takeaway from the COP26 as it relates to loss and damage and the ability to voice the importance of loss and damage in the finalized structure of the COP26 decisions was the lack of accessibility to the party negotiations for observers and others that might have Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous voice as a priority in terms of the collective path forward on climate change. And so when we consider loss and damage and ensuring that Indigenous people and countries that bear large populations of Indigenous people are able to scale at the point or at the level needed to reach the 1.5 degree goal and others related to buildings, transport, and energy, it's important to include loss and damage as a priority and as a major consideration when we are determining solutions that are going to make our climate change plans effective, not just in our respective countries, but globally. Aside from loss and damage and its impact on the Indigenous people, there are multiple instances where the UN Climate Convention may have or have not taken appropriate steps, especially when it comes to Indigenous people of the world. So to highlight some of the aspects of the UN Climate Change Convention that have aligned with the conversation of loss and damage and the effect on Indigenous people. So the UN Climate Change Convention included a variety of what were considered side events. The negotiations and other workshops and discussions happened, but those that addressed the climate change issue from the perspective or the lens of Indigenous people were considered side events. This can be taken in multiple different ways. However, when we talk about the centering of Indigenous people in the conversations related to loss and damage, as well as adaptation and mitigation, these formal negotiations and presentations that I attended and others that I did not attend hinged on the adherence to the Paris Agreement and what was purported as achievable in terms of goals for 2030 and 2050. The inclusion of Indigenous voice per firsthand accounts was more than previous COPs, according to one of the individuals that presented, but less than desirable for scalable and actionable solutions that include Indigenous voice and perspective. This was further illustrated by the calls in many of the conversations for more capacity building tools for developing countries that contain higher levels of Indigenous people, specifically in the area of climate financing. So in this vein, it's not merely about adapting to the Paris Agreement, but also holding governments accountable to the ways in which they are centering Indigenous people and centering the impact that our climate crisis has already had on the livelihood and the identity of Indigenous people globally. So the question becomes, how do we ensure that Indigenous peoples gain the technical knowledge and the financial capital to address mitigating climate impact and adapting to our new climate realities that we find ourselves in? And there are multiple aspects of the Paris Agreement that I just want to touch on briefly that will give you an idea of how the UN Climate Convention currently does or does not give voice to Indigenous people. In paragraph 11 of the Paris Agreement, this paragraph refers to the parties' NDCs, which Ashley mentioned earlier, and makes parties held accountable for their contributions to climate change on a global level. It was mentioned in relation to this paragraph that the Indigenous people should have opening and closing statements in the formal negotiations, and to provide a procedural improvement to these NDCs in order to give light and breath to the plans and the shortfalls that Indigenous people might have in reaching NDCs that are measurable and scalable in nature. Along with paragraph 11, Article 6 is another portion of the Paris Agreement that discusses the mitigation of emissions and the mechanisms for addressing climate change globally. It was identified and further clarified that this article needed to include more Indigenous people's voice. Particularly, the article was missing customary pieces of Indigenous people and their identity. One notable highlight or positive as it relates to COP26 was the Global Leaders Forestation Pledge, in which 110 countries pledged to reduce forestation. And of those countries that took the pledge, this covers 85% of the world's forests, which were committed to halting forest loss and bringing it down by half by 2030. There was also a commitment made of $1.7 billion to promote Indigenous land in this effort. So this is one way in which the UN Climate Convention has steered their efforts towards addressing Indigenous people. A newer aspect of the UN Climate Convention is the Paris Committee on Capacity Building Network, or the PCCB. This network was created by the UN to promote capacity building, and it's designed to combat the hierarchy of knowledge on adaptation and mitigation strategies to address climate change. And it's also designed to take Indigenous knowledge and make it scalable to solutions to reach 1.5 degrees and the 2030 and 2050 goals that were mentioned at COP26. Some considerations of the network are to develop bilateral relations and also include safeguards for carbon markets that affect Indigenous people, while making sure that we're adjusting our global emissions rather than transferring them from location to location, which again affects Indigenous people more heavily, and determining how Indigenous people and others can collaborate in participation to include more climate funding. So the last piece of what I'll share is how Indigenous people are having their issues addressed, and what is the US in particular doing to address these Indigenous people's concerns as it relates to climate change. So when we talk about whether Indigenous people's issues are being addressed, we have to first examine the entities that are working to curtail the aspect of climate change, like the UN, and what their goals are, what their perspectives are, and the accessibility to things like the COP conference for Indigenous people. In the process of doing research as it relates to the relationship between the League and the UN, I uncovered several shifting narratives across the course of this relationship, and also just shifting narratives about the UN in general as it relates to climate change. And so the COP is supposed to be a space to incite dialogue and resolutions to the climate crisis, but what are its objectives, and particularly its objectives as it relates to Indigenous people? So the ambitious goals that I mentioned earlier around getting to net zero and the 1.5 degrees have been communicated across countries that have provided national plans that have been largely void of Indigenous perspectives. Indigenous peoples have inhabited the land since the beginning of creation, and obviously are uniquely connected to the land in its sacred and spiritual nature. And this perspective must be included in order to address Indigenous issues at all. We can definitely learn a lesson from their ideologies in preserving the land, and also our individual behaviors that we carry out every day as it relates to addressing climate change. So we will not address Indigenous issues until we center Indigenous people and their foundational care for the land, center their practices that center around familial relationships, and begin a responsible stewardship of the land. The ways in which the US can assist by encouraging equitable incorporation of both science and innovation, making sure that the urgent narrative of climate change includes Indigenous people and our first inhabitants, and making sure that there's a plurality of voices at the table so that the political plans around climate change are public and we can hold governments accountable. Indigenous people are an instrumental part of this, and equity is the price of survival. And so climate futures without Indigenous people simply cannot exist. So thank you all for your time, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Tony. That was really insightful, and it gave us some ideas on how we can think about Indigenous people, both globally and within our own country, and how we should do more to incorporate their ideas into our climate plans. So Cynthia, you attended something called the Sustainability Innovation Forum. Can you tell us about that and what it was all about?
Sure, thank you, Robin. I am from the League in the Mid-Hudson region, upstate New York, and I've been an active advocate for natural resources since 1988, when I first joined the League. The Sustainable Innovation Forum was sponsored by Climate Action, and it's been uniting heads of state and multilaterals, environment ministers, business leaders, investors, and NGOs alongside the UN climate change negotiations. Sustainable innovation involves making intentional changes to a company's products, services, or processes to generate long-term social and environmental benefits while creating economic profits for the firm. So the forum took place over 3 days in 4 concurrent stages, featuring more than 200 speakers from governments and industries around the world. The 4 stages are organized by topic. The global climate action stage was where parties discussed the biggest challenges to sustainability. Much of the discussion was about funding the global south for mitigation and adaptation, loss, damage, and climate justice for the most vulnerable populations. The transition stage was where conversations centered around cooperation among different sectors, such as transport, urban centers, large corporations, and heavy industries. This is where I spent most of my time, and where hydrogen power was discussed, in addition to other new technologies available for carbon capture, emissions reduction, and use of digital information systems. The Reimagine stage was all about thinking outside the box, opening minds to new ways of thinking and re-examining the foundations of society and human interaction. Finally, the finance stage panelists looked at responsible investing and redirecting fiscal policy to support a sustainable and resilient economy, while encouraging growth in investments that drive the global financial system toward an inclusive and green world economy. A couple of points made frequently were the need for public-private partnership, and that's in regards to funding and policy, the need for global standards, the importance of data, and the phrase measure, measure, measure. On a, excuse me, on a personal note, I also found this to be the most optimistic portion of COP26. The technology absolutely exists in order to stay within the 1.5 degree threshold and thereby avoiding the worst effects of climate change. It should be noted here that we currently sit at 1.1 degrees. So that threshold is not as distant as many of us believed.
So where does it look like businesses are headed with respect to addressing climate?
Excuse me. I saw many major industries such as IBM, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Uber, Trane Technologies, and BMW. They all have an active process to guide their companies through the changes coming. Governments, businesses, and industries are taking notice and taking action. They're making meaningful investments in technology and understanding that these changes need to be made now. There are more, excuse me, there are more chief sustainability officers and more willingness to spend the resources required to move forward in a world where climate change is already occurring. Young people are sitting up and taking responsibility for their futures by choosing employment with these kinds of companies and otherwise supporting businesses with sustainable practices. There is a new market for ESG funds, which are environmental, sustainability, and governance funds. Bloomberg News reports that these funds are as financially successful for investors as other more traditional types. Concrete has been a significant emitter of CO2 due to its current use of fossil fuels in this manufacturing process. There are now producers making green concrete. One method uses a synthetic aggregate that they stated is actually carbon negative. Steel Zero or green steel is now being manufactured as well using electric or hydrogen power instead of fossil fuel in this energy intensive process. The mining industry is following suit, electrifying their mining equipment. One of the panelists pointed out that there are 70 different metals used in the cell phones we all have. The biggest problem appears to be the political will to make the changes in policy necessary to support businesses in doing what they know works and what is the right thing to do. Legislation, tax policy, and government support through municipal buying power for building and construction materials make a huge difference. Some companies have already voluntarily changed their products, company methodology, and commitment to sustainability. There is so much more interest in consumer purchasing habits, which also encourages companies to make changes. Financial responsibility for those in the global south remains elusive, and most of the rich nations that built their wealth on the backs of the third world with unfettered growth in polluting industries have not lived up to their promises. Finally, I must mention a carbon market, which was frequently included in discussions. It is agreed that this will have to be a part of the solution. The reality is the market, there must be global standards, measuring, pricing, currency, as well as rules and regulations. We are far from that now because all of the countries involved must agree unanimously on a fair system, as well as for meaningful penalties for those who work outside the established norms. Investment in a market will not happen without clear-cut policies. It is thought that carbon costs might be a new form of global currency or traded commodity, although it looks like climate change may actually eliminate a commodity market altogether. There's lots to do. One panelist said the scaffolding is there in the Paris Agreement, which is Article 6, but it currently sits empty. There is a lot of attention on it now, so I'm optimistic that this can be an important part of the global solution.
Do you want to say anything about blue or green hydrogen? Or
I do. It is really just so fascinating. Hydrogen power is generated by an electrochemical process using only hydrogen and oxygen, producing zero emissions electricity. Now, there are two different types. We have green and we have blue. Green hydrogen is made using renewables, and blue hydrogen is generated using fossil fuels, such as natural gas, nuclear power, or biomass. Biomass may be wood, agricultural waste, or other waste to energy products. It is being considered, and in some cases already used, in some large engine vehicles, as in aviation, boats, ships, rail, municipal buses, and very large trucks. What's really ideal about this fuel is that current diesel engines can be retrofitted to use it. Liquid hydrogen can be transported much like the current gasoline in tank trucks. The downside is supply. At this point, lack of infrastructure is the biggest issue. These facilities take a long time to build and require a large capital investment. It is happening though. Western states, as you know, have several in process or in planning already, and there are a few others, including one in Western New York State where I live. And this morning on the news, our governor just announced that there will be another hydropower plant, which is a green hydrogen plant, and it's going to work off a nearby wind turbine. So some places are considering blue hydrogen rather than green. While that is far from ideal, industry experts do understand that this may be the case at the moment, and note that any existing facility can be switched to renewables easily whenever the political winds blow their way. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Japan is a good case in point. This company is currently using green hydrogen at its port, in addition to pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, called direct air capture or carbon capture. The natural byproduct of this process is a rock-like substance. They are using a decommissioned transport to store the rocks and will sink the filled ship in the North Sea when it's full. Mitsubishi's goal is to be net zero by 2040, 10 years ahead of most other companies. Some may not wholeheartedly agree with these methods, but as one speaker stated, we must do everything now. Another stated efficiency is part of what makes things so slow. And yet another said, while we need to act now, we must do it right. mistakes will result in huge issues in the future. There's so much to know about hydrogen power that I've registered to attend the Hydrogen Transition Summit in late April and hope to learn more.
Before we go to our last panelist, I wanted to just encourage, if you have questions, to put them in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end of our next speaker. And even if we haven't covered the topic, feel free to ask the question and we'll try to answer it. So our last panelist is Carol, and we already know that money is very important in trying to solve the climate crisis. So Carol, why is the international finance part of the COP26 discussions, and how does it lead to reducing gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. So what I wanted to talk about was that while governments have a lot of power to regulate emissions, there can be a lot of disagreement, as in our US Congress, resulting in little progress being made. We all witnessed the failure of the Build Back Better bill this last December. And this bill was it was supposed to have more than 90% of Biden's greenhouse gas reductions that were to get us to the needed goal of 50% reduction by 2030. So international financial institutions hold a lot of money and therefore have the power to move projects forward in a more timely way. And at COP26, it was one of the 4 stated goals to mobilize public and private finance towards greenhouse gas reducing solutions. The goal was to mobilize at least 100 billion in global finance per year. And the participants of COP26 did not reach this goal, and it was widely reported as a failure. But the promise is, and the promise is now officially delayed to 2023. But it really is more complicated than just pledging money. As the US Treasury Secretary noted, Janet Yellen noted that as big as the public sector effort is across all of our countries, the 100 trillion plus price tag to address climate change globally is far bigger, and that the private sector needs to play a bigger role. Like Janet Yellen, most agree that it will take a lot more than the 100 billion a year to pay for greenhouse gas reductions, adaptations, and mitigations. The last pledge total, which was in 2019, was estimated to be around 100 billion per year. But these numbers seem to be squishy. And it should be noted that the pledges are comprised of grants, loans, and private sector funds. John Kerry thought the pledges at COP26 were somewhere in the area of $8 billion short, and that the amount may be able to be leveraged by the World Bank. But again, it is not really clear to me how poor countries are going to be able to pay back loans for greenhouse gas reducing projects when wealthy countries that can pay are not paying their fair share. Speaking of which, the US has not committed its fair share. I do want to say that I was very heartened to hear John Kerry, who I personally heard a couple of times, say that the US is the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, and that was only surpassed in 2006 by China. And so the US has a lot of responsibility for the warming of our planet. The US official statement of our financial support is the following. They made a pledge of 356 million in new support for adaptation, 20 billion in new public and private finance to help transition developing countries away from coal, 12 billion to combat deforestation, and 4 billion in regenerative agricultural project called Aim for Climate with the UAE. But again, these numbers are very squishy because it's not clear if the US part was only 1 billion of that 4 billion for the Aim for Climate. And so we can't hold these numbers specifically. However, analysis commissioned by the UN believes that the private financial sector could deliver 70% of total investments needed to meet net zero goals.
Did anything happen at COP to change how investing in green projects occur?
Oh, well, let me give you a couple of examples of the green projects that they had. And I just want to say that there were lists and lists of companies that committed to invest in green projects that were highlighted in almost every talk that I attended. I do want to talk about the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which goes by the acronym GFANZ, GFANZ. They had commitments of hundreds of financial service companies to deliver more than $130 trillion of investments to achieve net zero by 2050 and to get 50% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030 with reporting annually. That again, I think the number is kind of squishy, but I was heartened to see that Michael Bloomberg is the co-chair of this group. And a similar pledge came earlier from the Climate Finance Partnership, and that's a partnership between BlackRock and the governments of France, Germany, and Japan, as well as a number of leading U.S. impact investing organizations to align resources towards net zero emissions. And I just want to remind everybody, BlackRock is the company that got 2 environmentalists on the board of Exxon this last year. So the other thing that, the other examples I was going to talk about were there were like this Climate Action 100 Plus. It's a group of over 500 institutional investors controlling over 47 trillion assets. There was another Make My Money Matter campaign. It's a program in the UK to help individuals, organizations, and the government to invest pensions or retirement accounts in green portfolios. And I do want to take this little time right here to plug, I think, an advocate to advocate for all of us to look at our own investments and make changes to promote green investment funds and projects and divest from oil and gas companies. So now I want to answer your question, Robin. Did anything happen at COP26 to change investing in green projects? And I do want to say, I think there was real progress on sustainability disclosure statements. So disclosure statements are a key financial tool of investing. And you may know that publicly traded companies are required to disclose financial statements that include financial risks and executive pay, among other things. At COP26, a new board will now set a baseline of disclosure standards for sustainability. And so this means that climate-related disclosures will give investors information on financial and climate risks based on climate projections. More than 70% of listed companies that represent some of the world's largest carbon polluters, like Chevron, ExxonMobil, BMW, and Air France, alongside most of their external auditors, are not fully accounting for climate-related risks in financial statements. And this is despite, significant financial risks faced by climate crisis and the net zero pledges made by many. So these standard or disclosure standards should let investors compare apples to apples and hopefully lessen greenwashing. That is where companies mislead investors on climate gains. And there's international support for making these climate disclosure standards mandatory. UK is the first G20 country to make sustainability disclosures mandatory, with France and New Zealand following. Mandatory disclosures are expected to drive a need for carbon credits, which in turn drives emission reduction projects. And making these financial disclosures mandatory is on the docket for COP27. And I just want to add that that Mark Carney, the COP26 financial advisor, said that markets, require information to operate effectively, and what gets measured gets managed. So that's just part of what he was saying. So thank you very much, and I'll take your questions later.
Thank you, Carol. Before we go on to questions, I wanted to just to mention that as the league, we're members of what is called the Women's Gender Constituency. It's a group of NGOs from around the globe, and we try to act in concert with each other so that we make a positive effect on how gender issues are addressed within the rule books of the COP. And one of the things at COP was that we had to get tested for COVID every single day before we went in and show our results. And we're also given these masks, if you can see, every day a different color that we could wear either over our other mask or instead of, to really make it known that we were out in force and we wanted to make sure our issues were heard. And so is there anyone on the panel that wants to say something about the women's group and what you thought of it and how you thought the issues were being addressed with respect to women?
I'm happy to take a little stab at that, Robin.
Okay. Just a
Overall,
minute or two, so.
okay. Overall, I think that the impact of the Women and Gender constituency was definitely felt. It was an important milestone at the COP26 conference because some of the language under the Paris Agreement was still being bracketed, meaning that it was up for deletion. So agreements that had been reached in that global consensus, and including women and gender in those just transitions, was still at risk for being removed at COP26. So, the individual countries such as Mexico, who helped create the gender action plans, they were really leading that effort, and being a participant of the Women and Gender constituency gave us a firsthand account of what was happening in the negotiation rooms that we often as observers were not able to participate in. And so that was really informative. And that's what I can share on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley.
I would like to also add, if I might,
Sure.
in the business world, there is a ton of talk about women in leadership. There was a talk about women doing the work, particularly in mining, but there are cultural differences throughout the world. So it's harder in some places for women to pick up. But many of the speakers were women, and that includes the moderator and the business owners.
Thank you. We're going to go to questions now. I wanted to answer the first one that has to do with acronyms. NDC is the Nationally Determined Contribution. So this is the methodology under the Paris Agreement that allows each individual country to say how they are going to address their emissions and to reduce their emissions. So it is what they say. So they're not forced into like 50% of carbon reductions by 2030. If they think they only can do 20%, or if they could think they can do 80%, they can say that in their national statement. So it is what they say, and it was a way that under President Obama, he could finally get agreement for the Paris Agreement to be approved, that you had this national each country on their own determines how they're going to reduce their emissions. And then the IPCC is the International Panel on Climate Change. This panel is independent of the UN climate negotiations. It is a panel that advises the negotiations, but it is completely independent, and it is part of the UN Environmental Program and the World Meteorology Organization, which is separate from the COP and the climate treaty. Does someone also want to answer the question on what greenwashing is? Cynthia.
It's pretty simple. It's making products, you'll see, for instance, the recycled triangle on a lot of products when they're not recycled or recyclable in a lot of cases. It's just making them just be an educated consumer. You know, look at their packaging and look at the materials and look at where it comes from. So these are things companies try to make themselves look green when they're actually not.
Yeah, I'd like to expand on that. You know, it goes beyond just the marketing and the propaganda tools. It goes into what we see as solutions. So let me give a quick example. When we look at trees and how much carbon a tree can offset, an old growth tree, and we're looking at what Tony raised was that deforestation occurring across the globe. You know, a lot of industries will say, well, whatever tree I cut down, I've planted a tree. And so therefore it offsets that. That's a greenwashing tactic, because the carbon that's emitted in an old growth tree used for wood and for industry is tenfold to the carbon that is captured by a new tiny budding tree that takes time and years to be able to capture that. So when we're looking at these solutions, they're not zero sum, and they're often misguided in their solution approach.
Thanks. So a question comment come up about what we as being attending COP think of people like Greta Thunberg, who is very vocal about the lack of progress during COP. We heard a lot about that. She was at COP. She was within the space of COP. Do any of you have any comments about the lack of progress about COP, or how difficult it is to get progress?
Sure, I can take a shot at
Carol.
that one.
Okay, Tony first and Carol.
Yeah, so I would say the combination of the transparency discussion that Ashley raised, in addition to the ousting of Indigenous perspectives and the lack of plurality at the table, I feel that the solutions, you know, are inevitably missing aspects to make them scalable, to make them sustainable, and to make them reach the timelines of 2030 and 2050. I think that the accountability aspect of Greta Thunberg and her vocalization of the lack of transparency and accountability of nation states is one step to making sure that from an advocacy standpoint, we are able to vocalize and hold countries accountable, not only for their NDCs, but as Carol mentioned, their financing pledges that often fall flat when it comes to actual implementation. So I think that the concerns were warranted from my own personal experience and the barriers to being able to attend negotiations and other things that would actually move the climate conversation forward. And I think that it raises important questions and important considerations about who is at the table, not just at formal conferences like COP, but in the larger discussion.
Thank you. Carol?
Yeah, and I would like to add that that I do think Greta has a lot to say of the outrage of the youth. And I think it's really important to hear this. You know, she's looking at what is actually happening in the world. You know, the UN is talking about reducing greenhouse gases, but what's happening in the world? We're actually increasing in our greenhouse gases. And so, you know, I think it's really important what's happening at COP. I don't think it was a failure. I think there was, good discussions and there was a lot of negotiations, but not enough has happened, and not as enough happened at COP26, and it hasn't happened around the world because, you know, the bottom line is we have to reduce greenhouse gases.
Thanks, Carol. There's a question that has to do with carbon credits and offsets, about actually reducing emissions. So the Paris Agreement will include a carbon market. They're not calling it a market, but that's what it is. It's under Article 6 of the agreement, and it's the rule book for Article 6 has been finalized. And part of the rules in Article 6 are that they try to show that the emissions or credits that countries are claiming will be reducing the emissions, although there's still a few open questions about that. The implementation of Article 6 won't happen. The full implementation probably will take maybe 5 more years to complete because it's such a complicated thing and there are different parts of it. But within the rules, there are statements that say that they have to reduce emissions. They you can't have a credit if it's not helping reduce emissions. So I hope that answers the question. Anyone else want to add something? Okay.
I could add that if we have the carbon markets, the agreement for carbon markets throughout different countries, that's going to be encouraging other countries to join in these carbon markets or carbon taxes. So I think we are going to be able to have progress with carbon markets and carbon taxes, hopefully within the US pretty soon.
And I wanted to just share something that came out of the COP26 negotiations, which is still incredibly controversial, which is part of reaching an agreement. They were able to develop an accredited and a non-accredited pathway. And that is for that market exchange. And so what that basically boils down to in a very simplified way is giving developing nations or giving nations that are incapable of moving away from these types of energy sources, coal or global emitters as their main version of energy, that they can do a non-accredited path. So it's like a partial credit. So instead of reaching specific goals and standards that they know they are not able to reach, and then present an NDC report that fails to achieve their outlined goals, that they would basically get partial credit. It would be non-accredited, but it would still be partial credit towards those motions that they are making. Again, that brings to issues transparency and credibility. So if somebody's not able to achieve the goals that they established for themselves, and they're doing it via a non-credited pathway, how are we really able to trust their efforts at all? So there's a lot of concerns over the dual pathway for the carbon market.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. So I was wondering, Cynthia, do you have any feel for whether green hydrogen is, where was that, more efficient than blue or as efficient as blue hydrogen?
Once the plant is built, it's all the same. And the product is zero emissions. The way that you get there, whether it be fossil fuels or wind turbines, that's that's what really makes the difference. But however it's generated, it still results in the same product. I would encourage people to look at what New York State is doing. We are a world leader, excuse me, and no need to reinvent the wheel. The technology is there, and it's less to make it renewable than it is to sit there and use fossil fuels.
This question is saying, what is it trying to address what the league can do to make a contribution to reducing carbon? So in any of the areas you spoke to, what might the league do, either on a local, state, or national level? If maybe each of you can address it. Carol?
Yeah, I can start out. I talked a little bit about Biden's Build Back Better bill. That bill is supposed to be dead now, and they're supposed to be starting over. And I've heard from several different people or several different news agencies that the climate provisions in the Build Back Better bill might be passable. And so I think it's really important that the league take action, when there is some legislation towards climate, greenhouse gas reducing climate provisions, that the league take action to write their congressmen and senators to encourage this kind of action, because the government regulation can make a huge difference. And so I just really encourage the league to take actions to notify everybody in the whole country to support climate greenhouse gas reducing projects.
Anybody else have ideas? Cynthia?
Education, education, education. Tomorrow night, our league is hosting an event on solid waste management. Learn about what is happening in your area. Speak to your town, speak to your county officials, your state officials. We all do legislative visits here a couple of times a year. Any opportunity that you have will both create relationship with your elected officials and let them know that it's important.
Something that I attended as one of the conversations in a side event was a discussion on the LGMA, the local governments and municipal authorities. It was a conference of mayors from around the world that made carbon commitments and pledges to reduce their emissions. The league operates at a local level. You can go to your local cities, your local counties, and you can ask your elected officials to either join this network or to make specific carbon pledges to help reduce the emissions. I am from San Francisco Bay Area, and as progressive as the city of San Francisco is, it is the largest contributor to global emissions in the state of California. And so this is an option that we have to ask our elected officials to double down on their promises, as well as being league members. I think collectively, in all the conversations I had with my fellow observers, which I will say, this was a tough conference to attend. So thank you for allowing me to lean on you. cry on your shoulder, drink our worries away, and to come up with solutions, the one thing we all collectively decided was that the league needs to do more. We are the only country that is industrialized that still does not believe in the climate crisis. So if we want the United States, which is the largest of the emitters, to do something, we as League need to ask our national government to believe, and we have that ability. So let's make climate a priority for the US League of Women Voters. Thank you.
Tony, there's a question here about Indigenous peoples. And is there a way that local leagues can ensure that some of their concerns and knowledge be taken seriously in the climate space?
Yeah, so this somewhat piggybacks on the previous question in regards to what you can do. So I think leveraging our diversity, equity, and inclusion policy in terms of diversifying the partnerships in which we engage in on the local, state, and national level, again, brings together a more plurality in the discussion of climate change and environmental justice in particular. Of course, as you all may have identified, environmental justice is kind of what resonates with me. So the Indigenous piece of things is very important to that conversation. So I think developing partnerships and bilateral relationships with any and everyone you can to mobilize around the ideas of loss and damage that has already occurred, which obviously impedes Indigenous people's ability to be able to spring forward and address things like adaptation and mitigation. It's almost not possible if their perspectives aren't included in our solutions. So I would just encourage partnering with as many diverse individuals, organizations, and et cetera that you can to create a coalition of people power, because essentially at the end of the day, we can hold our government accountable for what they've said they're going to do, and also fill in the gaps for the things that we know need to be included, such as more capacity building, more climate funding for Indigenous peoples in general. So our demands have to be at the table, and one way to do that is to engage our partnerships in a way that really mobilizes us from the ground up in holding our government accountable and making sure that their plans for climate change are transparent so that we can hold them accountable both in policy and in voice at the table.
Oh, thank you, Tony. I wanted to add one other thing, and that is litigation. We haven't talked at all about that, but one of the things for Indigenous people that they can do to make their voices heard is to litigate. So when they lose portions of their land, that's important to them, whether their rights to fish and are affected by climate change and reduction of good fisheries. And if they can find a person to sue, whether that's the government or a company, that might be one way for their voices to also be heard. I don't know if any of you can say anything about reducing emissions from large-scale agriculture. I didn't attend anything about that. I don't know if there's any other comments. Cynthia.
They have the Green Climate Fund, which the whole point of the fund, and it's affiliated with the UN. And so the whole point of the fund is to provide gap funding for soil remediation or changeover from hard, the agriculture that hurts the land to sustainable systems. So that will take place over a few years. And so that's what the Green Climate Fund, that was pretty impressive that they're out there and they're all over the world.
Carol?
Yeah, I actually am very interested in regenerative agriculture. However, they didn't have much the first week, or at least when I could go to attend the meetings. The one meeting that I did attend was in the U.S. Center, and the U.S. Center is the U.S. Pavilion, talking about what they're doing. And I was pretty impressed with our agriculture secretary, Tom Vilsack. He was using all the right words of trying to preserve the soil, create healthy soils, using cover crops, using less fertilizer, protecting the farmer profits, protecting the small farmers, and using technology to measure carbon that's being sequestered. And so I actually felt much better hearing them talk. And it was a panel that I was watching, including a regenerative farmer in the U.S. That our U.S. administration will hopefully lead us down the right path for this administration.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
Yeah, I wanted to make one more point. There's a thing called agrivoltaics, and they're using it in the Midwest, and they've started using it, more widely. But it's the having a farm and putting solar panels over the top of your crop, because it keeps moisture in, and it keeps the earth cooler, so they could have a better biodiversity on the ground. And and so it provides a profit for the farmer just by leasing the land. And then they do grapevines, there's kale, they said, and a lot of the grazing lands, they are grazing beneath the solar panels, and it's very exciting.
Real fast, Robin, one thing I learned from attending some of the side events with the indigenous perspectives was the take on how to use the land and the land rights. And the takeaway was that, Mother Earth works in systems. So these linear approaches that you hear as solutions are failing, because as soon as you push in one direction, you get pulled from another. And so what the takeaway I learned, which was something I want to repeat here, is that you feed your enemies and you house your friends when it comes to agriculture. Instead of using pesticides to kill all the bugs, you give those bugs a new fuel source, something to feed on, so that they are still part of the overall system of Mother Earth. And when you make solutions that are system driven, nature-based, you're not going to have those unintended consequences that often the political decisions show the fallout from. So thank you.
I think there was also within that discussions of indigenous peoples, there was also discussions on how to restore natural areas and ecosystems, which was one of the questions. But I think, because Debbie is visible now, I think we need to close. So I'll pass it over to Debbie.
Thank you, Robin, and thanks to all of you. I'm very sorry that we're out of time for this program, because I know that there are many more questions that we would like to ask on these complex issues within COP26. We appreciate that the attendees today have such deep interest in this important topic. Thank you so very much to our excellent speakers for such a stimulating and informative discussion. We're grateful for your dedication to tackling the climate emergency, for joining us today, and for your significant time commitment to build a more equitable and clean energy future. Thanks too for your recommendations on actions that we can take. I'd like to take a moment to remind our viewers and listeners that the Oregon primary election is May 17th. If you are new to Oregon or have changed your address or name since the last election, please update your registration. You can do this through our online voter education site located at vote411.org. The League of Women Voters is a membership organization. We welcome you to join us, and we would also value your financial support as we present these and other relevant programs. Please see our membership and donor information site at lwvpdx.org. Thank you again for joining this program. Thank you again to our speakers. Please take care and stay safe.